Thomas Wilkins stood at the edge of his failing cornfield, watching as a woman he'd never met before set up an expensive-looking camera on a tripod. Less than 24 hours ago, she'd been a stranger asking permission to camp on his land. Now her documentary about rural farm life showcasing his humble struggles and connection to the land was going viral online. His phone hadn't stopped ringing all morning, with calls from news outlets wanting interviews. After years of fighting foreclosure and praying for rain, Thomas couldn't believe that this quiet filmmaker might be the miracle that saved everything he loved. Before we carry on, please hit the subscribe button to make my day, and let me know where you are watching from in the comments. Tomorrow's story is about a school bus driver who finds a backpack full of cash and makes a decision that will shock everyone in town. The morning sun spilled across Thomas Wilkins' weathered kitchen table, illuminating the foreclosure notice that had arrived the previous day. Outside his window, fields that had been in his family for 4 generations stretched toward the horizon, fields that might soon belong to someone else. He rubbed his calloused hands over his face, feeling the deep creases etched by years of worry and hard labor. At 53, Thomas had the lean, sinewy build of a man who'd never known anything but physical work. His light brown hair had gone mostly gray at the temples, and permanent crow's feet framed eyes that had witnessed too many failed harvests. The drought had stretched on for 3 seasons now, turning what should have been profitable acreage into a financial nightmare. The bank had been patient, more patient than most would be, but even their goodwill had limits. Thomas had 90 days to come up with enough money to catch up on his mortgage payments, or the auction signs would go up. The farm equipment dealership had already repossessed his newer tractor last month, leaving him with only the ancient John Deere his father had purchased back in the 1988s. Thomas folded the notice and tucked it into the drawer where he kept all the other bills, a growing collection of paper reminders of his failure. His wife, Margaret, had passed away 5 years earlier from cancer, leaving him alone to manage everything. Their only son, David, had fled to Chicago the moment he turned 18, desperate to escape the hardship of farm life. They barely spoke now, connected only by awkward holiday phone calls and the occasional text message. He poured himself a cup of coffee and stepped out onto the porch. The morning air held a hint of autumn crispness, though summer's heat would return by midday. It was early September, harvest time approaching, but his corn yield would be pitiful this year. The irrigation system he'd invested in 3 years ago had broken down repeatedly, and the parts to fix it properly were far beyond his budget. Thomas's property stretched across 200 acres, though much of it had gone unplanted in recent years as he'd been forced to scale back operations. The house and main barn sat on a gentle rise, overlooking fields that sloped down to meet Cooper's Creek, a modest waterway that marked his eastern boundary. As Thomas walked the gravel path toward the small barn, he noticed a vehicle parked at the bend in his long driveway. It was a dark blue SUV, modest but newer than anything he'd driven in the past decade. Thomas frowned. He wasn't expecting visitors, and salespeople rarely ventured this far from town. Curious and a bit wary, he changed direction and headed toward the vehicle. As he approached, he saw a woman standing beside it, studying something on her phone. She was perhaps in her mid-30s, dressed practically in hiking boots, cargo pants, and a light blue button-down shirt with the sleeves rolled up. Her dark hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and large sunglasses obscured much of her face. What caught Thomas's attention wasn't her appearance, but the expensive-looking equipment being unloaded from her vehicle. A professional camera on a sturdy tripod stood nearby, along with what appeared to be sound equipment and several hard-sided cases. "Morning," Thomas called out when he was within earshot. "Can I help you with something?" The woman looked up, startled, then quickly recovered and offered a polite smile. "Good morning. I'm sorry to intrude. I was hoping to speak with the owner of this property." "You're speaking to him, Thomas Wilkins." He didn't extend his hand, keeping a cautious distance. "Mr. Wilkins, I'm Olivia Chen." She removed her sunglasses, revealing dark, intelligent eyes that assessed him quickly. "I'm a filmmaker working on a documentary project about American waterways and the surrounding ecosystems. Your creek caught my attention when I was researching this area." Thomas frowned slightly. Cooper's Creek was hardly remarkable, a modest stream that eventually joined the larger river about 10 miles east. My creek? Olivia nodded enthusiastically. It's one of the few in this region that hasn't been significantly altered by commercial development or agricultural runoff. The riparian zone is surprisingly intact. I've been documenting various waterways across the Brashenay country, focusing on their ecological significance and the people who live alongside them." End quote. Thomas wasn't entirely sure what a riparian zone was, but he understood enough to know she was some kind of environmentalist. In his experience, environmentalists and farmers didn't always see eye to eye. "I'm not interested in being in any documentaries, Ms. Chen, and I've got work to do." He turned to leave, already dismissing her from his mind. "I understand," she said quickly. "I'm not asking you to participate. I was actually hoping for permission to camp near the creek for a few days to film the wildlife. I noticed you have a small clearing by the bend that would be perfect. I'd stay completely out of your way." Thomas paused, considering. The creek area she mentioned was far enough from the house that he'd barely notice her presence. And while he wasn't eager for company, there was something in her straightforward manner that didn't set off any internal alarms. "You planning to make trouble for farmers in this documentary of yours?" he asked bluntly. Olivia shook her head. "Not at all. My focus is on the waterways themselves, the ecology, the wildlife, the natural cycles. I document what I find, not what I expect to find." Thomas studied her for a moment longer. The truth was, he could use the money, however modest the amount might be. "I don't typically allow camping, but I might make an exception. For a fee." If she was surprised by his stipulation, she didn't show it. "That's completely fair. Would $50 per day be acceptable? I'm planning to stay for up to a week, possibly less if I get the footage I need sooner." The amount was more generous than Thomas had expected. A quick calculation told him that could be up to $350 enough to cover the overdue electric bill with some left over for groceries. "You'll need to follow some rules. No fires except in a contained camp stove. Stay away from my livestock. And don't go wandering around the farm buildings without permission." "Absolutely," Olivia agreed readily. "I'll respect your property and privacy. I'm here for the creek ecosystem, not to disturb your operations." Thomas nodded slowly. "All right then. You can use that clearing by the big bend in the creek. There's a path that leads down from where this driveway curves. I'll take the first 2 days' payment now, and we'll see how it goes." And Olivia reached into her pocket and pulled out her wallet, counting out 5 $20 bills. "Thank you, Mr. Wilkins. I appreciate your flexibility." As he pocketed the money, Thomas felt a twinge of something not quite shame, but close to it. It bothered him that he was reduced to renting out a patch of ground to make ends meet. But pride wouldn't pay the bills, and he was well past the luxury of turning down income, however small. "There's a water pump near the old oak if you need it. Water's clean. Comes from our well." It was the closest he would come to a welcoming gesture. "Thank you. I brought plenty of supplies, but that's good to know." She hesitated, then added, "I noticed your cornfields on the drive in. This drought must be making things difficult." Thomas stiffened. He didn't discuss his financial troubles with strangers, especially not city people who wouldn't understand the complexities of modern farming. "I manage. Been doing this all my life." Olivia seemed to sense his discomfort and changed the subject. "Well, I won't keep you from your work. I'll get set up down by the creek and stay out of your way." Thomas nodded and turned to leave, already refocusing on the day's tasks ahead. "Creek floods sometimes when it rains hard up north. Even if it's dry here, keep an eye on the water level if the weather changes." Olivia worked methodically, setting up her camp with the efficiency of someone who had done this many times before. Her 4-person tent was larger than necessary for just her, but she needed the extra space for her equipment. A compact table unfolded to create a workspace for her laptop and portable hard drives, and her solar charging station would keep everything powered. What she hadn't mentioned to Thomas Wilkins was that she wasn't just any documentary filmmaker. Olivia Chen had made a name for herself with her series Hidden Waters, which had won critical acclaim and a devoted following on streaming platforms. Her approach, intimate, honest, and visually stunning portrayals of overlooked natural spaces, and the people connected to them had resonated with viewers tired of sensationalized nature documentaries. Her most recent installment, focusing on a desert spring in Arizona and the Native American community fighting to protect it, had gone viral and caught the attention of major environmental organizations. Now she had funding for a full season of new episodes, with Cooper's Creek intended as the opening feature. By mid-afternoon, Olivia had her camp established and her primary equipment ready. The September sun cast golden light across the water, creating perfect conditions for her first shooting session. She waded carefully into the shallow creek, her camera protected in a waterproof housing, and began capturing the underwater world's small fish darting between rocks, the hypnotic patterns of sunlight filtering through the surface, the gentle current shaping the sandy bottom. Time slipped away as she worked, lost in the meditative process of documentation. It was only when her stomach growled insistently that she realized the sun was setting. Emerging from the creek, she dried off her equipment and set up her camp stove to prepare a simple dinner. As she ate, Olivia reviewed the day's footage on her laptop, making notes for tomorrow's shooting plan. The quality was excellent. This location had even more potential than she'd anticipated. The creek supported a surprising diversity of life, and the evening light created stunning visuals as it played across the water's surface. Movement caught her eye, and she looked up to see Thomas Wilkins walking along the creek bank, about 50 yards upstream. He didn't approach her camp, but paused occasionally to examine something on the ground or in the water, conducting his own survey of the property perhaps, or simply taking an evening walk. Olivia considered calling out a greeting but decided against it. His body language suggested he wasn't seeking interaction. Instead, she observed him discreetly, noting the way he moved with familiarity through the landscape, his eyes constantly assessing, his hands occasionally reaching down to test the soil or adjust something only he could see. Needed fixing. This was what fascinated her about people who worked the land, their intimate knowledge of their surroundings, their physical connection to the environment that most modern humans had lost. Thomas Wilkins might not use the terminology of ecology or conservation, but he read the landscape with a fluency that came from decades of daily observation. Inside her tent, with her laptop casting a blue glow across her features, Olivia began the process of organizing and backing up the day's work. On a separate document, she made notes about Thomas Wilkins and his farm observations that might prove useful if the human element of this story developed further. Farmer shows signs of financial strain, she typed. Equipment appears old, fields partially fallow. Solo operation, no visible farmhands or family assistance. Pride intact despite hardship. Classic American farmer archetype: independent, resilient, possibly stubborn. Potential story angle: last of a dying breed? Holding on to family legacy against mounting economic pressures? Olivia paused, considering whether she was being presumptuous in her assessment. She had a tendency to narrativize people quickly, an occupational hazard of documentary filmmaking, but her instincts were usually sound, and everything about Thomas Wilkins suggested a man fighting a losing battle against forces beyond his control. Thomas awoke before his 5 a.m. alarm, as he had nearly every day of his adult life. Farm habits died hard, even when there was less farm work to do than in years past. He moved through his morning routine, mechanical coffee first, then a simple breakfast of toast and eggs from his own chickens. The kitchen felt too large for just one person, as it had since Margaret's passing. He'd never been one for unnecessary talk, but the absence of her gentle morning chatter still left a hollow space in his day. After breakfast, Thomas pulled on his work boots and headed out to check on his livestock. The eastern sky was just beginning to lighten, painting the clouds in shades of pink and gold. He'd never tired of farm mornings, even as everything else about agricultural life had grown harder. As he drove down the rutted path that led to the creek, Thomas spotted movement near the water's edge. Olivia Chen was already up and working, standing knee-deep in the creek with her camera pointed at something just below the surface. She wore quick dry pants rolled up to her knees and appeared completely absorbed in her task. Thomas parked the truck and approached the pump housing, keeping a respectful distance from his tenant. But curiosity got the better of him, and he found himself watching her work. Her movements were precise, patient, almost ritualistic, as she waited motionless for long moments before adjusting her position slightly and continuing to film. "Morning," he called out, not wanting to startle her by working silently nearby. Olivia looked up, seeming momentarily disoriented as she shifted her attention from whatever she'd been filming. Then she smiled, a genuine expression that transformed her serious face. "Good morning, Mr. Wilkins. You're up early." "Always am," he replied, opening the metal housing that protected the irrigation pump. "Checking the pump. Storms might be coming tomorrow." "I heard the forecast," she nodded. "Don't worry about me. I've camped through plenty of bad weather." Thomas grunted acknowledgement as he examined the pump's filters for debris. "Creek can rise fast here. Flash flood once took out a whole section of bank 10 years back." Olivia waded carefully out of the water, carrying her camera. "Thanks for the warning. I'll move my equipment to higher ground before the storm hits." As she reached the bank, Thomas could see she held a small waterproof case in her other hand. She opened it, revealing a tiny camera no bigger than a golf ball. "Just collecting my time-lapse camera. It's been running all night." "Catch anything interesting?" Thomas asked, surprising himself with the question. "A family of raccoons visited around midnight. A few deer before dawn." She smiled again. "And something I think might have been a mink, though it moved too quickly for a clear shot." Thomas nodded. "Plenty of mink around here. They den along the banks upstream." "You know the wildlife well," Olivia observed, setting her equipment on a folding table near her tent. Thomas shrugged as he closed the pump housing. "Been watching them all my life. My grandfather used to trap mink for their pelts back when that was still good business. Taught me to read their signs when I was just a boy." Olivia's eyes lit with interest. That's exactly the kind of local knowledge that gets lost between generations. The relationship between people and the land changing over time. Something in her tone made Thomas wary again. It sounded too much like the beginning of a lecture about how farming practices had changed for the worse. How modern agriculture had lost its connection to nature. He'd heard it before from well-meaning environmentalists who'd never had to make payroll or watch crops fail despite their best efforts. "Need to check the corn," he said abruptly, turning toward his truck. "Storm might damage what's left if it hits hard." "Of course," Olivia replied, her tone neutral. "I didn't mean to keep you from your work." Thomas paused, feeling a twinge of guilt at his brusque response. She was paying to be here after all, and hadn't actually said anything critical. "Water level marker is on that post there," he said, pointing to a painted stake driven into the creek bank. "If it rises above the red line, you should move to higher ground. You're welcome to use the equipment shed up near the house if things get rough." The offer surprised them both. Thomas rarely invited anyone into his spaces, and Olivia clearly hadn't expected the concession. "Thank you," she said simply. "I appreciate that." By midday, dark clouds were building on the western horizon, moving in faster than the forecast had predicted. Thomas hurried to secure loose equipment and move anything vulnerable to water damage. As he worked, he found himself glancing toward the creek, wondering if Olivia Chen was heeding the warning signs of the approaching storm. Olivia tracked the storm's approach with the weather app on her phone. The system was intensifying and moving faster than initially predicted, with potential for heavy rainfall and strong winds. She methodically broke down her outdoor setup, storing cameras and sound equipment in waterproof cases and securing them inside her tent. As the first fat raindrops began to fall, Olivia finished weatherproofing her camp. She'd repositioned her tent on higher ground, following Thomas's advice about the creek's potential to rise. Still, if the rainfall was as heavy as predicted, the entire clearing might become problematic. The sky darkened ominously as the storm front arrived in earnest. Wind whipped through the trees along the creek bank, and rain began falling in sheets. Inside her tent, Olivia opened her laptop to review the morning's footage while waiting out the weather. But the sound of rushing water soon drew her attention. Peering out through the rain-streaked tent flap, she saw that the creek was already rising, muddy water moving much faster than the gentle flow of the previous day. Olivia checked the water level marker Thomas had pointed out. The creek hadn't reached the red line yet, but it was climbing steadily. Given the intensity of the rainfall, she decided not to risk waiting until the last minute. Quickly, she packed her laptop and essential equipment into waterproof bags, then dismantled her tent in the pouring rain, struggling against the wind that threatened to tear the fabric from her hands. With her gear loaded into heavy waterproof duffels, Olivia began the soggy trek up toward the farm buildings. The rain hammered down with surprising force, turning the dirt path into slick mud that made walking difficult, especially while carrying her equipment. By the time she reached the equipment shed Thomas had mentioned, she was drenched and exhausted. The sound of the door opening behind her made Olivia turn quickly. Thomas Wilkins stood in the doorway, also drenched from the storm, carrying a flashlight. "Creek's rising fast," he said without preamble. "Saw you heading this way. Good call moving your gear." "Thank you for letting me use the shed," Olivia replied, pushing wet hair from her face. "The storm hit harder than I expected." Thomas nodded, stepping inside and closing the door against the howling wind. Weather Service upgraded it to a severe thunderstorm warning, flash flood warnings for the whole county. He hesitated, then added, "You might be stuck here a while. Forecast says it could last through the night." Olivia tried not to show her concern. A night in an equipment shed wasn't ideal, but she'd weathered worse conditions during her filming career. "I'll be fine. I have some emergency supplies in my pack." Thomas seemed to struggle with something internally before speaking again. "House has electricity and running water. Spare room that's not being used. Makes more sense than camping in my shed during a flash flood." The offer clearly didn't come easily to him, and Olivia appreciated both the gesture and the practical reasoning behind it. Still, she was hesitant to impose. "That's very kind, but I don't want to intrude on your space." "Not kindness, just common sense," Thomas replied, though the gruffness in his tone seemed more habitual than genuine. "Can't have you getting hypothermia on my property. Bad for business." The hint of dry humor surprised her. "Well, when you put it that way, how can I refuse?" Thomas helped her gather her equipment, carrying the heaviest bags as they made a dash through the rain to the farmhouse. Inside, the house was modestly furnished, but clean and well-maintained. Thomas led her to a small mudroom off the kitchen, where they could remove their wet outer layers. "Bathroom's upstairs if you want to dry off," he said, hanging his soaked jacket on a hook. "First door on the right. Spare bedroom's next to it. There are clean towels in the hallway closet." After a quick hot shower that restored feeling to her chilled limbs, Olivia changed into dry clothes. As she toweled her hair, Olivia studied her reflection in the bathroom mirror, considering her unexpected situation. This was not how she'd planned to develop a rapport with Thomas Wilkins. She preferred to establish relationships with her documentary subjects gradually, allowing trust to build naturally as they became accustomed to her presence. Being thrust into his personal space by a weather emergency changed the dynamic entirely. When Olivia returned downstairs, she found Thomas in the kitchen, stirring something on the stove that smelled delicious. He'd also changed into dry clothes, a faded plaid flannel shirt, and worn jeans that had seen countless washings. "Hope you like chili," he said, without turning around. "It's nothing fancy." "Chili sounds perfect after getting soaked," Olivia replied. "Can I help with anything?" Thomas gestured toward a loaf of bread on the counter. "Could slice that if you want. Bowls are in the cabinet to your right." They worked in surprisingly comfortable silence, the domesticity of the task creating a natural rhythm between them. Olivia found plates and silverware, setting 2 places at the kitchen table without being asked. Thomas filled a metal kettle and placed it on a back burner, presumably for coffee or tea later. The kitchen, like the rest of the house, showed signs of a woman's touch from years past. Curtains with a faded floral pattern, a collection of decorative plates on one wall, small touches that Thomas had apparently maintained but not added to. Olivia wondered how long he had lived alone here, but didn't ask. As they sat down to eat, Thomas surprised her by speaking first. "You said you're filming a documentary about waterways. That seems like awfully specific subject matter." Olivia nodded, grateful for the opening. "It's part of a series I've been working on, called Hidden Waters. Each episode focuses on a different body of water, the ecosystem it supports, how it shapes the surrounding landscape, and the people whose lives intersect with it." "And people watch this?" Thomas asked, his tone genuinely curious rather than dismissive. "More than you might expect," Olivia replied with a small smile. The first season has over 15 million views online. People are drawn to stories about places they might never visit themselves, especially when those places are disappearing or changing. Creek's been running through this property since before my great-grandfather bought the land, Thomas said. Used to be deeper. Drought's been hard on it, same as everything else around here. The comment opened a door that Olivia hadn't expected so soon. How long has the drought been affecting this area? Thomas took a sip of water before answering. 3 years of below-average rainfall. This year's been the worst. Corn yield will be maybe 40% of normal, and that's with irrigation pulling from the creek when I can manage it. That must be incredibly challenging, Olivia said, careful to keep her tone neutral rather than pitying. Farming's always challenging. Nature doesn't owe us good conditions. The stoicism in his voice was undermined slightly by the tightness around his eyes. But this stretch has been harder than most. Lots of farms around here going under. Including yours? The question slipped out before Olivia could consider its bluntness, and she immediately regretted it. I'm sorry. That was too personal. To her surprise, Thomas didn't seem offended. It's a fair question, given the state of things you can see for yourself. He set down his spoon and looked directly at her. Yes. Including mine, most likely. Bank's patience is running out. Can't blame them, business is business. The frank admission caught Olivia off guard. She'd expected more resistance to discussing financial troubles. I'm sorry to hear that. Has your family been here a long time? 4 generations. My great-grandfather purchased the first 100 acres in 1903. My grandfather doubled it. My father maintained it. And I'll be the one to lose it. The matter-of-fact way he stated this made it all the more poignant. That's not for your documentary, by the way. Just answering your question. Of course, Olivia assured him, though her documentarian's mind was already seeing the narrative potential. Everything is off the record unless you explicitly agree otherwise. After dinner, as they sat on the porch watching darkness settle over the farm, a comfortable silence between them, Olivia found herself unexpectedly emotional about the situation. In just one day, she had discovered a story far more compelling than she'd anticipated when she first selected Cooper's Creek as a filming location. I want you to know, she said carefully, that I think what you're dealing with here, the struggles of family farms, the impact of climate change on agriculture, these are important stories that often go untold. If you ever did want to share your perspective, I believe it could help people understand what's happening to rural America. End quote. Thomas gazed out at his rain-soaked fields, considering her words. Not sure anyone cares much about old farmers going broke. Been happening for decades. People care more than you might think, Olivia countered gently. There's a growing disconnect between urban consumers and the sources of their food. Your story could bridge that gap, help people understand the human cost of the agricultural changes happening across the country. Thomas didn't respond immediately, and Olivia didn't push. She'd planted a seed, but it would need time to germinate. They continued sitting in companionable silence, watching lightning flash in the distance as the storm began to move eastward. Morning arrived with watery sunlight filtering through dissipating clouds. The storm had passed, leaving behind puddles that reflected the brightening sky and fields glistening with moisture. Thomas was already awake and working when Olivia came downstairs, the smell of coffee and frying bacon greeting her. Hope you slept okay, Thomas said by way of greeting, sliding eggs from a cast-iron skillet onto 2 plates. Figured you might want breakfast before heading back to your camp. I slept very well, thank you, Olivia replied, accepting the offered plate. How bad is the flooding? Creek's over its banks but receding. Your camping spot's underwater, though not as bad as I feared. Road to town should be passable by afternoon. He poured coffee for both of them and sat down across from her. Got some cleaning up to do around the place. Storm blew down some branches, tore loose a section of the equipment shed roof. Olivia nodded, her mind already calculating how this would affect her filming schedule. I can help with cleanup if you'd like, before I reset my camp. Thomas looked surprised at the offer. You don't have to do that. Not part of our arrangement. Consider it neighborly assistance, Olivia suggested. Besides, I'm curious to see more of your operation. It would help me understand the context of the creek ecosystem better. It was a professional justification, but not entirely honest. The truth was, Olivia found herself genuinely interested in Thomas and his farm, beyond just their potential as documentary subjects. There was something compelling about his quiet resilience, the way he carried his burdens without complaint. After breakfast, they surveyed the damage together. The creek had indeed breached its banks, water spreading several yards beyond its normal course. Olivia's campsite was partially submerged, though her decision to move equipment the previous day had prevented any losses. The farm buildings had weathered the storm reasonably well, with the exception of the equipment shed's roof panel that had come loose in the wind. "I can hold the ladder while you work on the roof," Olivia offered, rolling up her sleeves. Thomas looked skeptical. "You sure about that? Not exactly what documentary filmmakers usually do." "I'm not filming today anyway until the water recedes," she pointed out pragmatically. "And I'm stronger than I look." Over the next few hours, they worked together repairing storm damage around the farm. By noon, they'd made significant progress, and Thomas seemed impressed by her willingness to tackle physical labor. "You're not what I expected," he admitted as they paused for water near the barn. "Most city folks I've met would be complaining about broken nails and lack of cell service by now." Olivia laughed. "I spend weeks at a time in remote locations for my work. I've camped in deserts, hiked through swamps, and once spent 3 days on a small fishing boat during a nor'easter to get footage. Farm work is actually quite pleasant by comparison." "Still," Thomas said, wiping sweat from his brow, "you didn't sign up for manual labor when you asked to camp here. I appreciate the help." "Actually," Olivia began, seizing the opening, "this is giving me a much better understanding of how the creek integrates with your farming operation. If you're still open to it, I'd love to include some of this context in my documentary." Thomas considered for a moment, then nodded slowly. "Guess I could answer some questions about the creek, how we use it for irrigation. Nothing too personal, though." "Of course," Olivia agreed quickly. "Just factual information about how the waterway supports agriculture." By late afternoon, Cooper's Creek had largely returned to its banks, though running higher and faster than before the storm. Olivia's campsite was muddy, but usable again. Thomas helped her reset her tent on slightly higher ground and retrieve the rest of her equipment from the house. "You're welcome to keep using the bathroom at the house," he offered as they finished setting up. "Probably more comfortable than whatever camping arrangements you have." "That's very kind, thank you," Olivia replied, surprised by the continued hospitality. It seemed the storm had washed away some of Thomas's initial reserve. That evening, as Olivia reviewed her footage and made plans for the next day's filming, she felt a growing sense of purpose about this project. Cooper's Creek wasn't just an ecological feature, it was a thread running through human lives, through economic systems, through the changing relationship between Americans and their food sources. And Thomas Wilkins, with his quiet dignity and looming loss, personified a pivotal moment in that ongoing story. The following morning, Thomas met Olivia at the creek as agreed, looking somewhat self-conscious, but determined. "So, how do we do this?" he asked, eyeing her camera setup with mild apprehension. "Should I prepare something to say?" "Just be yourself," Olivia assured him, adjusting her equipment. "I'll ask questions, and you answer naturally. We can always do multiple takes if needed, but authentic responses usually work best." She positioned Thomas near the irrigation pump, with the creek flowing behind him creating a perfect visual context. The morning light cast a golden glow across the scene, highlighting the weathered lines of his face and the practical intelligence in his eyes. "Whenever you're ready," Thomas said, squaring his shoulders slightly. Olivia began with simple questions about the creek, how long it had been part of the farm's water management, how its flow had changed over his lifetime, what wildlife he remembered seeing along its banks as a child, compared to now. Thomas answered thoughtfully, initially stiff, but gradually relaxing as the conversation flowed. "My earliest memory of this creek," he told the camera, "is coming down here with my grandfather when I was maybe 5 years old. He taught me to fish with just a piece of string, a bent pin, and some bread for bait. Caught a sunfish right about there." He pointed to a shaded pool beneath an overhanging willow. Creek was deeper then, ran strong year-round. Now it dries to a trickle in late summer unless we get lucky with rain. As the interview progressed, Olivia gently steered the conversation toward the challenges facing small farms. Thomas spoke with surprising candor about the economic realities that had pushed family operations like his to the brink. Used to be you could make a decent living on 200 acres, he explained, gazing across his fields. Now, the big operations run thousands of acres, have equipment that costs more than my entire farm, contracts with processors that small farmers can't access. Economy of scale, they call it. And the drought has made things worse? Olivia prompted. Thomas nodded. 3 bad years in a row. Each one, I plant with hope, pray for rain, watch the sky instead of the markets. Could handle economic pressure or climate pressure, but both together. He shook his head, not completing the thought but not needing to. What will happen to the farm? Olivia asked, the camera capturing the momentary flicker of pain that crossed his features before his expression settled back into stoic acceptance. Bank forecloses in 90 days unless I find about $70,000, he said matter-of-factly. Then it goes to auction. Probably get bought by one of the corporate operations expanding through the area. They'll tear down the house. The barns buildings my grandfather raised with his own hands put up metal structures that can house bigger equipment. More efficient that way. How does that make you feel? It was a standard documentary question, but Olivia found herself genuinely wanting to know the answer. Thomas was quiet for a long moment, looking out across the land that had been his family's for generations. Like I've failed, he finally said, his voice low but steady. Not just my ancestors who worked so hard to build this place, but the future generations who won't ever know what it means to be connected to land this way, my son included. He met Olivia's eyes directly. But feeling sorry for myself won't change what's coming. Just have to face it, with whatever dignity I can muster. The honesty of his answer caught Olivia off guard, creating one of those rare documentary moments that transcended the typical interview format. She let the camera run silently for several seconds, capturing Thomas's expression as he gazed across his farm, the weight of his impending loss visible in the set of his shoulders. Throughout the day, they continued filming at various locations around the property, the aging barn with its hand-hewn beams, the fields where drought-stressed corn struggled to produce, the family cemetery where Thomas's parents, grandparents, and wife were buried on a quiet hillside overlooking the creek. At each location, Thomas shared stories and observations, gradually painting a picture of a way of life that was disappearing not just from his own future, but from the American landscape as a whole. By late afternoon, Olivia had hours of powerful footage. Thomas had proven Dawn to be a natural on camera, his authenticity and thoughtfulness coming through clearly. They ended the day's filming back at the creek, where Thomas demonstrated how he monitored water quality and flow rate to determine irrigation schedules. The creek and I have a deal, he explained, crouching to scoop water in his weathered hands. I only take what I absolutely need, and I try to keep it clean for whoever's downstream. My father taught me that water isn't really owned by anyone, we're just borrowing it for a while. Over the next 3 days, Olivia and Thomas fell into a comfortable routine. Mornings began with filming Thomas at his daily chores, feeding animals, checking irrigation, walking fields to assess crop conditions. Afternoons were spent exploring different aspects of the farm's relationship with Cooper's Creek. Thomas proved to be an increasingly engaging subject, his initial reserve giving way to thoughtful reflections on farming, family history, and the changes he'd witnessed over his lifetime. On the 4th day, as they were reviewing some footage together on Olivia's laptop, her phone rang with a call from her producer. She excused herself and walked a short distance away to take it. Chen here, she answered professionally. Olivia, the sample footage you sent is extraordinary. Her producer's voice carried the unmistakable tone of excitement that came with recognizing exceptional material. The farmer Wilkins, is it? He's perfect, authentic, articulate, visually compelling. And the story angle is exactly what we've been looking for to elevate this season. I'm glad you see the potential, Olivia replied, glancing back toward Thomas, who was still examining her laptop screen with interest. There's a real human story here, alongside the environmental narrative. More than that, her producer continued enthusiastically, this could be our breakout piece. I've already shown it to the network executives, and they're talking about featuring it prominently in our marketing. They might even want to spin it off as a special feature. Olivia felt a surge of professional pride mixed with surprise. That's unexpected. I thought this would just be one segment of the season. It started that way, but this is too good to limit. Listen, the network wants to move quickly on this. Can you get more in-depth material on the foreclosure angle? The conflict between family farming and corporate agriculture? That's the human drama that will draw viewers. I can, Olivia said slowly, but I want to be careful about how we frame this. Thomas Mr. Wilkins isn't looking for publicity or to become a symbol. He's just trying to maintain his dignity through a difficult transition. Of course, her producer assured her, though Olivia detected the slight impatience that suggested personal concerns were secondary to the story potential. Just keep getting the material. We'll handle it respectfully in editing. After ending the call, Olivia returned to Thomas, her mind racing with the implications of the network's interest. What had begun as one segment in a documentary series about waterways was evolving into something much larger. Everything okay? Thomas asked, noting her pensive expression. Yes, Olivia replied, deciding not to share the full scope of the network's interest yet. My producer was just giving me some feedback on the footage. She thinks it's coming together well. That evening, as they ate dinner on the farmhouse porch, Olivia found herself contemplating the ethical dimensions of documentary filmmaking more deeply than usual. The line between documenting reality and influencing it had always been blurry in her profession, but never had it felt quite so personal. You've been quiet tonight, Thomas observed as they finished their meal. Having second thoughts about spending so much time on a failing farm? The question was asked lightly, but Olivia sensed the genuine uncertainty beneath it. Not at all. Actually, I'm thinking this material might be more significant than I initially planned. My producers are very impressed with what they've seen. Thomas raised an eyebrow. Not sure what's impressive about watching a man lose his livelihood, but I suppose that's why you're the filmmaker and I'm just the subject. It's not about showcasing failure, Olivia clarified quickly. It's about telling an important story about American agriculture, rural communities, and our relationship with the land. Your perspective matters, especially because it's becoming increasingly rare. Thomas considered this, then nodded slowly. Well, if it helps someone understand what's being lost when places like this disappear, I suppose that's something worthwhile coming from this mess. The next morning, as Olivia was setting up for another interview, Thomas approached her with an unexpected proposal. There's something I want to show you, he said, his manner suggesting this was significant. Something I haven't talked about yet that might add another dimension to your story. Intrigued, Olivia readily agreed. Soon they were following a narrow trail along the creek bank on Thomas's ATV, heading upstream from her camping spot. After about 15 minutes, the trail widened into a small clearing beside the creek. This is the oldest part of the property, Thomas explained as they walked toward the water. Land my great-grandfather purchased first, before expanding the farm. Family lore says he chose this spot because of that. He pointed across the creek to where a remarkable formation rose from the opposite Banca natural spring bubbling up from limestone rocks, creating a small waterfall that cascaded into the creek. The morning sunlight caught the falling water, transforming it into a glittering curtain against the dark stone. It's beautiful, Olivia said sincerely, already framing shots in her mind. The visual appeal was undeniable, but she wasn't sure how this connected to the documentary's themes. It's more than just pretty, Thomas continued, leading her closer. This spring has never run dry, not even during the worst droughts on record. My great-grandfather called it the heart spring, because as long as it was beating, the land would survive. He crouched beside the creek, dipping his hand into the clear water. The water from this spring keeps this section of the creek flowing even when other parts slow to a trickle. It's why Cooper's Creek has always been more reliable than other waterways in the region. Olivia knelt beside him, camera forgotten for the moment, as she absorbed the significance. So, this spring is essentially drought-proof? That seems incredibly valuable in today's climate conditions. Thomas nodded. That's what I've been thinking these past few years. Most farmers around here are drilling deeper wells or watching their irrigation ponds dry up. Meanwhile, this spring keeps flowing at a constant rate, year-round. He stood, gesturing to the surrounding area. I've been experimenting up here, out of sight of the main farm. Started 3 years ago when the drought first hit. For the first time, Olivia noticed what appeared to be an experimental garden area set back from the creek-raised beds, with various plants growing in controlled conditions. A small greenhouse-like structure made from salvaged windows, and what looked like a homemade irrigation system that channeled water from the spring. "What exactly are you growing here?" she asked, following as Thomas led her toward the plots. "Drought-resistant heritage crops," he explained, pride evident in his voice. "Seeds passed down through my family, plus varieties I've sourced from other farmers facing similar conditions. Plants that can produce with minimal water, resist pests naturally, and still provide good nutrition." Inside the makeshift greenhouse, Thomas showed Olivia trays of seedlings and carefully labeled seed storage. "I've been selectively breeding for drought tolerance, trying to develop strains specifically adapted to our changing conditions. It's small scale, just a hobby really, but it could be significant," Olivia finished, her mind racing with the implications. "You're essentially creating a genetic bank of drought-resistant crops, developed through traditional farming knowledge rather than corporate bioengineering." Thomas nodded, seeming pleased that she understood. Corporate agriculture develops seeds for maximum yield under ideal conditions with heavy chemical inputs. I'm looking for plants that can survive when conditions aren't ideal, using methods any farmer could replicate without expensive technology. Olivia began filming, capturing the experimental plots, the spring that made them possible, and Thomas explaining his methodology. This was exactly the narrative element she'd been missing. Not a magical solution to his financial problems, but a demonstration that traditional farming wisdom might hold answers to modern agricultural challenges that corporate approaches overlooked. "How long have you been doing this?" she asked, as she filmed him harvesting seeds from a particularly robust tomato plant. "Started small after Margaret passed," Thomas replied. "She always kept a garden, and I found it therapeutic, I guess, to continue that work. When the drought hit, it became more purposeful. Now I correspond with a network of other farmers doing similar experiments. We exchange seeds, share results." "And does the bank know about this work?" Olivia asked carefully. Thomas shook his head. "It's not the kind of thing that changes a balance sheet. Can't put a dollar value on seeds that might produce better crops years from now. Banks deal in this quarter's numbers, not long-term resilience." Back at the farmhouse that evening, Olivia called her producer to share the exciting development. The response was immediate and enthusiastic. "This is gold, Olivia," the producer exclaimed. The seed-saving angle ties perfectly into current conversations about agricultural resilience and corporate control of food systems. We need to highlight this prominently, maybe even adjust the title to reflect this new dimension. The remainder of the day was spent filming additional material about Thomas's seed-saving work, including close-ups of his meticulous records and the various heritage varieties he was preserving. By evening, Olivia had a wealth of new footage that significantly expanded the documentary's scope and added a crucial element of forward-looking hope to what had previously been primarily a story of loss. That night, as they sat on the porch watching fireflies emerge in the gathering dusk, Thomas made an announcement that took Olivia by surprise. "I've been thinking," he said quietly. "If your network is serious about this documentary, I'd like to reach out to my son. He should see this not just what's being lost, but what might still be saved." "I think that's a wonderful idea," Olivia replied, warmly. Family connections are precious, especially during difficult transitions. Thomas nodded, his expression a complex mixture of hope and apprehension. "Haven't told him about the foreclosure yet. Kept thinking I'd find a solution first. Wouldn't have to admit defeat. But your film might be a better way for him to understand what's happening here than any explanation I could give." The next week passed in a blur of intensive filming. With the new focus on Thomas's seed-saving work in addition to the conventional farming and Creek ecology, Olivia had more material to capture than originally planned. Thomas seemed energized by sharing this aspect of his work, speaking with genuine passion about the heritage varieties he was preserving and the potential they held for farming in increasingly unpredictable climate conditions. On her final day at the farm, Olivia arranged for drone footage to capture aerial views of the entire property. As the drone operator packed up his equipment, Thomas and Olivia stood at the edge of a cornfield, watching the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the land. "So, that's it?" Thomas asked, squinting against the sunlight. "You have what you need now?" Olivia nodded, feeling strangely reluctant to confirm that her work here was done. "I think so. The footage is extraordinary, Thomas. Your story, this place, it's all come together in a way that exceeds anything I could have hoped for. When do you leave?" His question was practical, devoid of sentiment, but Olivia sensed the unspoken weight behind it. "Tomorrow morning," she replied. "I need to get back to begin the editing process. My producer wants to fast-track this for a special screening event in Chicago, actually, where your son lives. Environmental groups, agricultural policy experts, media, they'll all be there. You'd be welcome to attend, of course. It might be a good opportunity to reconnect with David Inval. Person." Thomas considered this, then nodded slowly. "I'll think about it. Still need to call him, let him know what's happening with the farm." That evening, they shared a final dinner at the farmhouse. Olivia had purchased ingredients in town and prepared a meal more elaborate than their usual fair gesture of gratitude for Thomas's hospitality and openness. Over roasted chicken and vegetables from his garden, they discussed practical matters related to the documentary's completion. The next morning, Olivia packed her equipment in camp with Thomas's help. As she loaded the last of her gear into her SUV, she turned to Thomas, suddenly awkward in the moment of departure. "Thank you," she said simply, "for your trust, your openness, everything you've shared." Thomas extended his hand formally, and Olivia took it, feeling the calluses and strength built over decades of physical labor. "Thank you for listening," he replied. "Not many do these days." The drive away from the Wilkins farm was more emotional than Olivia had anticipated. Through her rearview mirror, she watched Thomas's figure growing smaller, standing straight-backed at the end of his driveway, hand raised in farewell. She couldn't help but wonder if she'd be the last person to document this place as the Wilkins farm, if her filming had captured the final chapter of a multi-generational story. But as she reached the main road and turned toward the interstate that would take her back to her urban life, Olivia felt a renewed sense of purpose about the project ahead. Thomas's story deserved to be told with all the complexity and nuance she could bring to it. And perhaps, just perhaps, telling it might lead to outcomes neither of them could yet imagine. The next 3 weeks passed in a blur of intensive editing sessions, supplemental interviews, and constant communication with the network. Olivia worked longer hours than she ever had before, driven by both the tight deadline and her personal commitment to doing Thomas's story justice. 10 days into the editing process, Olivia reached out to David Wilkins in Chicago, sending a professional email explaining the documentary project and extending an invitation to the upcoming screening. His response surprised her with its immediacy and concern. "Ms. Chen," it began formally, "thank you for your message regarding the documentary about my father's farm. I must admit I was surprised to learn about this project, as my father hadn't mentioned it in our limited recent communications. While I appreciate the invitation to the screening, I'm curious about the nature of the documentary and concerned about how my father is being portrayed, and the protective tone suggested a more complicated relationship between father and son than Thomas had indicated. Olivia arranged a phone call to address David's concerns directly. "I want to be clear," David said, after Olivia had explained the project in more detail. "My father and I may have our differences, but I don't want to see him turned into some kind of rural poverty stereotype for urban audiences to feel sorry for. That's absolutely not the approach we're taking," Olivia assured him. "Your father is presented as knowledgeable, innovative, and resilient. The documentary examines systemic issues in agriculture that have made it difficult for family farms to survive, regardless of how well they're managed. and it highlights your father's experimental work with heritage seeds, which has significant potential value for sustainable agriculture." End quote. There was a pause on the line. Heritage seeds? Dad's actually talking about that? Surprise colored David's voice. He's been sending me emails about those experiments for years, but whenever I try to discuss it during our calls, he changes the subject. Says it's just a hobby, nothing worth mentioning. It's a central focus of the documentary, Olivia explained, intrigued by this glimpse into their relationship. Your father's knowledge of selective breeding for drought resistance, combined with traditional farming techniques, offers a powerful alternative to corporate agricultural approaches. He showed you the spring site? David sounded genuinely shocked now. He never takes anyone there. That was my mother's favorite spot on the farm. After she died, it became like a private memorial for him. Olivia absorbed this information, understanding now why that location had seemed so personal to Thomas. "I didn't realize," she said quietly. He presented it primarily in terms of its agricultural significance. "That's Dad," David said with what sounded like a mix of exasperation and fondness. Everything filtered through the farm perspective. He sighed audibly. "So the bank is really foreclosing? He hasn't told me directly." "Yes," Olivia confirmed gently. 90 days from when I started filming, which is now down to about 60 days. Unless something changes dramatically. Another long pause followed. "I'll come to the screening," David finally said. "And I'd like to see a rough cut beforehand, if that's possible." Olivia immediately emailed Thomas to update him about the conversation. Thomas's reply was brief, but revealed his emotion in its uncharacteristic exclamation. "He's coming to the screening. Thank you, Olivia. This means more than I can say." 2 days before the Chicago screening, Olivia sent the completed documentary to her network executives for final approval. Their response was everything she had hoped for: enthusiastic praise for the film's emotional impact, visual beauty, and social relevance. On the evening before flying to Chicago for the screening, Olivia received an unexpected call from Thomas. "Just wanted to check in before tomorrow," he said, his voice carrying the slight awkwardness of someone unaccustomed to making personal calls. "I spoke with David yesterday. First real conversation we've had in years. He said some things about the farm, about what he saw in the documentary. Made me think maybe I've been wrong about what he wants." "In what way?" Olivia asked gently. "Always assumed he wanted nothing to do with farming, with the family legacy, but the way he talked about seeing the place on screen, there was something there I hadn't heard before." Thomas's voice held a note of cautious hope. "Anyway, just wanted you to know that something's already changed, even before this film reaches a wider audience." The Harris Theater in downtown Chicago gleamed with sleek modernity, its glass facade reflecting the city lights as evening fell. Inside, the venue buzzed with activity as staff prepared for the screening of Seeds of Resilience. Promotional posters featuring a striking image of Thomas standing beside Cooper's Creek, the farmhouse visible in the background, lined the entrance hall. Olivia arrived early, elegant in a simple black dress that contrasted with her usual field attire. She oversaw the technical checks, ensuring the documentary would be presented with optimal sound and visual quality. Her producer and network executives circulated among early arrivals, agricultural experts, and media representatives who had been invited to the event. Thomas arrived an hour before the screening, looking different in his suit, a garment that had likely hung unworn in his closet for years, but carrying himself with the same quiet dignity Olivia had observed on the farm. "Thomas!" Olivia called, making her way through the crowd to greet him. "You made it. Wouldn't have missed it," he replied with a small smile, visibly relieved to see a familiar face. "Quite a production you've put together here. The network has been incredibly supportive," Olivia explained, guiding him toward a quieter area away from the growing crowd. "There's significant interest in your story from environmental groups, agricultural policy experts, even some potential funders for sustainable farming initiatives." Thomas nodded, appearing somewhat overwhelmed by the implications. "And David? Has he arrived?" "Not yet, but he confirmed he's coming." Olivia checked her watch. "The screening starts in 45 minutes. 20 minutes before the screening was scheduled to begin, Olivia noticed a shift in Thomas's attention, his gaze fixed on the theater doors. Following his line of sight, she saw a man who could only be David Wilkins, the same strong jawline as his father, the same direct gaze, though softened by stylish glasses and framed by a more contemporary haircut. "He's here," Olivia said softly to Thomas, whose expression had transformed into a complex mixture of pride, nervousness, and hope. "Yes," Thomas replied, straightening his shoulders slightly. "Guess I should go," Olivia encouraged. "I'll handle things here." She watched as Thomas made his way across the room toward his son. Their meeting was understated, no dramatic embraces or visible emotion, just a handshake that turned into a brief, awkward hug, followed by conversation too distant to overhear. But even from across the room, Olivia could see the tension gradually easing from Thomas's posture as they talked. The theater filled quickly, an energetic buzz of anticipation rising from the audience. Olivia took her place between Thomas and her producer, with David seated on his father's other side. As the lights dimmed and the network introduction began to play, Olivia found herself unexpectedly nervous about how Thomas would feel seeing his life and impending loss projected on a massive screen before Bass. Strangers. The documentary opened with the aerial footage of the Wilkins farm, Cooper's Creek winding like a silver ribbon through the drought-stressed landscape. Thomas's voice, steady and unadorned, provided the narration. "This land has been in my family for 4 generations. My great-grandfather broke the soil, my grandfather expanded it, my father modernized it, and I'll be the one to lose it." And from that powerful opening, the film unfurled Thomas's story with intimate detail and broader context. The personal struggles of maintaining a family farm in changing economic and environmental conditions, interwoven with expert commentary on agricultural policy, climate challenges, and the disappearance of traditional farming knowledge. The audience was visibly moved by footage of Thomas explaining his connection to the land, and fell into reverent silence during the scenes at the spring site, where his passion for heritage seed preservation shone through. As the credits rolled over a stunning time-lapse sequence of the creek flowing through seasonal changes, spontaneous applause broke out in the theater, quickly swelling to a standing ovation. Thomas remained seated, appearing somewhat overwhelmed by the response. David placed a hand briefly on his father's shoulder, a small gesture, but significant in its support. The post-screening discussion began with the network executive introducing Olivia, who spoke briefly about the documentary's evolution, before inviting Thomas to join her on stage. When the discussion opened to audience questions, the first came from a representative of a sustainable agriculture foundation. "Mr. Wilkins, your work with heritage seeds is extraordinarily valuable, especially your focus on drought resistance. Has anyone approached you about continuing this work in a more formal capacity?" Thomas seemed surprised by the question. "No, nothing formal. I correspond with other farmers doing similar experiments, but it's all very grassroots. To be honest, I've been more focused on trying to save the farm than thinking about what comes after." Another question followed from an environmental policy expert. "Given the clear value of your approach to agricultural resilience, have you considered seeking grant funding or institutional support to continue your research, even if the farm itself changes hands?" "I haven't," Thomas admitted. "Wouldn't know where to begin with something like that." Near the end of the session, a voice from the audience asked, "What would it take to save the Wilkins farm as a working demonstration site for these agricultural techniques? Is there a specific financial threshold that would prevent the foreclosure?" Thomas looked momentarily uncomfortable discussing such personal details, but then answered with his typical candor. "Bank says I need about $70,000 to bring the mortgage current and get a 2-year extension. That would buy time to implement some of these methods on a larger scale, maybe achieve profitability again if rainfall patterns improve." The moderator, sensing the shift toward fundraising, prepared to move on, but David Wilkins suddenly stood up in the front row. "With the moderator's permission," he said, his voice steady but charged with emotion, "I'd like to address that question as well." Surprised, the moderator nodded, and David made his way to the stage. Standing beside his father, the family resemblance was striking despite their different attire and life paths. "I'm David Wilkins," he began. Thomas's son. Until watching this documentary, I didn't fully understand what my father has been developing at the spring site. Like many children who leave family farms, I focused on what I was escaping: the financial stress, the physical toll, the uncertainty. What I failed to appreciate was the knowledge being preserved, the connection to the land that goes beyond mere ownership. He turned slightly toward Thomas. My tech company in Chicago recently completed a successful funding round. I'm in a position to help prevent the foreclosure, not just as a son helping his father, but as an investment in work that is demonstrable value for our agricultural future. But I don't think this should be just a family matter. What my father is preserving belongs to our collective agricultural heritage. So, I'm prepared to establish a matching fund for every dollar contributed towards saving the Wilkins farm as a working demonstration site for these techniques. I'll match it up to the full amount needed. The audience erupted in applause, with several people immediately rising to express interest in contributing. Thomas stood motionless, visibly stunned by his son's announcement. When the moderator returned to the microphone, Thomas finally spoke. "I don't know what to say," he admitted, his voice rougher than usual with emotion. "Never expected anything like this." Later that evening, as audience members crowded forward to speak with Thomas and David, Olivia stood slightly apart, observing the scene with a mixture of professional satisfaction and personal joy. Her producer appeared at her side, beaming with excitement. "This is unprecedented," the producer gushed. "The network is already talking about a follow-up documentary on the farm's transformation, and the social media response is exploding. We're trending nationally." Olivia nodded, acknowledging the professional triumph, but more focused on Thomas and David, who stood together amidst a crowd of interested supporters, their body language suggesting a bridge being rebuilt between them. 1 month later, Olivia stood once again beside Cooper's Creek, camera in hand, documenting a very different scene than her first visit. The foreclosure notice had been canceled, replaced by a flurry of activity as the Wilkins farm began its transformation into the Wilkins Agricultural Resilience Center. David had temporarily relocated from Chicago to help with the transition, living in the farmhouse with his father as they developed plans for expanding the Heritage Seed Program. The documentary, Seeds of Resilience, had surpassed all expectations, gathering millions of views online and sparking nationwide conversations about sustainable agriculture, family farming, and climate adaptation. Universities had expressed interest in research partnerships, and agricultural students now visited regularly to learn traditional farming techniques being adapted for changing climate conditions. As Olivia filmed Thomas and David walking the fields together, discussing irrigation improvements that would maximize the spring's output, she reflected on how a simple request to camp by a creek had led to the remarkable transformation. The Wilkins farm had been saved not by charity, but by recognition of the value inherent in Thomas's knowledge and approach value that might have been lost without documentation. Cooper's Creek still flowed as it always had, indifferent to human concerns yet central to human flourishing. The water that had sustained generations of Wilkins farmers would now nourish new growth, not just of crops, but of ideas, connections, and possibilities that bridged past wisdom and future needs. And Thomas Wilkins, no longer the last of his line to work this land, walked alongside his son with the quiet pride of a man who had not failed his ancestors after all, but instead had found an unexpected way to carry their legacy forward into a changing world.